Today, I'd like to talk about one of the most complex and significant time periods in Ukrainian art history, the Ukrainian Sixties. Loosely stretched between the late 50s and early 70s, the 60s were supposed to be the generation that built communism. Instead, this generation started to undermine it, filled with a complete disillusion in false values and the ruling party's hypocrisy. Today, the 60s are believed to be the starting point for further development of many important artistic endeavors that constituted Ukrainian contemporary art the way we know it now. Yet, the phenomenon of the 60s remains a subject of debate due to the unclear ethical nature of the artist's interrelation with the political regime of the time. The rich legacy of the 60s deserves wider national and international recognition, as it speaks volumes about Ukrainian cultural identity. Artists of the 60s, in many cases, shared a common ambiguous position. They formed the first solid group of cultural resistance in the post-war years, yet remained deeply embedded into the Soviet art system, brought bands of forgotten chapters of folk and ancient art histories, as well as promoted the emancipation of national identity, yet kept being engaged in state-commissioned works as the only means for making one's living within the professional. Here we can see a piece of artwork by Alla Horska. It symbolically depicts a map of Ukraine, though we don't see all the big cities or any real shapes. We see several important centers representing different parts of the country. Kyiv, the capital, in the north center, Odessa in the south, down by the Black Sea. We can also see a fortress which symbolizes Zaporizhia, the historical center of Cossack state, and one of the modern industrial centers in the southeast. And we can see Lviv in the west, with several figures blowing the trombitas, a folk musical instrument, a sort of an alpine horn made of wood, common among Ukrainian highlanders, the Hutsuls or Hutsuli, who lives in the western Ukraine. But we shouldn't talk about the Ukrainian 60s as something geographically solid either. After the Second World War, Ukraine was more or less reunited in its historical borders as we know them now, despite the full-scale invasion of Russia. During the 60s, the main cultural centers known today were formed. Those centers had perhaps more differences than similarities. In the 60s, they found themselves under the same ideological umbrella of Union of Artists as the main governmental body behind the art scene. The body in charge of all the commissions, policies, and strict control over any artistic activity. While artists of Kyiv and Odessa artistic communities were under the Soviet regime in the years after the Bolshevik Revolution, their colleagues in Lviv and Uzhhorod, brought under USSR jurisdiction in 1939 and 1945 respectively, had a completely different backgrounds and still had quite close ties with European schools. Yet it was the 60s period, with all its relative liberations and paradoxes, that brought this varied, rich and under-researched to this day art scenes of different parts of the state together and formed a core identity for what we know today as Ukrainian contemporary art. The artistic scene of 60s was in no way a uniform phenomenon. Instead, it rested on contradictions, even tensions, between such binary aspects as official and non-official, public and undisclosed, state-commissioned and banned, and so on and so forth. Today, I'm not going to talk about the so-called official art or the so-called social realist art, which was a complicated and interesting phenomenon on its own, despite the fact that basically it was an artificial artistic style to serve the political needs of the state that created and sponsored it. Today, we're going to talk about the unrestricted and uncensored artistic movements and ideas that exist behind the scenes of the official cultural life, about art that existed not because, but despite the official politics of the Soviet Union, and more precisely, the Soviet Ukraine during the 60s. It is important to mention that when we talk about the 60s, we are not necessarily talking about specific 10 years between 1960 and 1969. We're talking about what I call the extended 60s, which started in the late 1950s as a result of the so-called Khrushchev thaw, or vidliga, the period of relative liberalization in civil and cultural life. And it ends in the early 70s, marked by the so-called Brezhnev zasty, and particularly in the case of Ukraine, with the assassination of the artist and political activist Alla Horska. We're going to talk about her in a moment. Today, I won't be able to tell you about all the fascinating aspects of project, names and events from the history of the Ukrainian 60s. Instead, I will try to outline several important concepts that simply have to be known to be able to understand the essence of Ukrainian 60s. And I will talk about several artists to illustrate them. So, the Ukrainian 60s was the generation of the closed communities. Many artists lived in a sort of a double life. Most of them were members of artist union, because without this membership, one couldn't have access to any kind of professional work and therefore no access to money-making. The artists had to balance between private works condemned by the authorities and revealed only to a small circle of trusted colleagues from one side, and the state-commissioned works or monumental, decorative or applied arts. Commissions usually came from local cooperatives, major enterprises or publishing houses. But the real conversations about art couldn't have been spoken freely in the narrowest circles of like-minded people, wittily described, in the case of Kyiv communities, as Kyiv monks by art historian Boris Lobanovsky. Having no real opportunities to exhibit their non-official works in the state institutions, the artists were looking for alternative solutions. In Odessa, the so-called apartment exhibitions were quite important. Friends and admirers from the intelligentsia circle would offer their small apartments to hang works for one evening only and invite friends. This exhibitions format influenced the way artists used to work. We can see mainly small format paintings, because they simply wouldn't find any exhibition opportunity for the bigger ones. So I would love you to imagine the artistic life of, for example, Lyudmila Yastreb from Odessa, who works on a large-scale mosaic panel exposed to thousands of people during the daytime, and later exhibits her smaller paintings only to a group of 20-something people. This would be a typical portrait of the generation. It was also Odessa, where two artists had the courage to make a public statement and exhibit their works, if only for several hours, in a real public space in the very city center. Valentin Hrush and Stanislav Sychov organized what is now known as a fence exhibition, Zaborna Выставка. Literally, a simple wooden fence around the construction site around the famous Odessa Opera. Needless to say, this exhibition lasted only for a few hours, but we are lucky enough to have at least this piece of photo documentation. In Lviv, artists were not used to organize private or semi-public exhibitions. Instead, they organized private self-education initiatives, such as the so-called Home Academy of Roman Selsky and another one of his student, Carlos Verinsky. This home academy were hermetic safe spaces for honest professional conversations and exchange of information about European artistic movements. Roman Selsky himself was studying art in Paris and had a great collection of books and actual artworks which served as a precious source of a different non-Soviet knowledge for his younger colleagues. One of the important features of the 60s we need to mention is that it was also a time of reconsideration of the national identity. One can say that the 60s were the period when Ukraine rediscovered itself. Naturally, the artists were the most curious and adventurous explorers on this path. One of the most internationally acknowledged masterpieces of the Ukrainian 60s is the film The Shadow of Forgotten Ancestors by Sergei Parajanov, an Armenian filmmaker and visual artist who for many years lived and worked in Kyiv and was an integral part of the local art community and was especially famous for his parties. The film was based on a classical novel Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors by Ukrainian writer Mikhailo Kochubinsky, that tells a Romeo and Juliet tale of young Ukrainian Hutu lovers trapped on the opposite sides of a Carpathian family blood feud. The film was Parajanov's first major work and earned him international acclaim. Many artists were involved in the production, led by Georgi Yakutovich, which was one of the early discoverers and promoters of Carpathian Hutu aesthetics, which was not really visible at that moment outside of the region. During the 60s, many artists from Lviv and Kyiv traveled to the mountains for plein airs, but also to recharge their mental batteries and stay outside of the tension of the city. Today, we can look at this Carpathian fascination as a sort of escapism and search for an alternative, uncontrolled political and cultural reality. Throughout the film's festival run in spring 1965, it would represent the Soviet Union and not the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, despite the fact that it was very distinctively Ukrainian. This film premiered in September 1965 in Kyiv at the Ukraina movie theater. This Kyiv's premiere drew significant political protest due to the growing imprisonment and oppression of Ukrainian intellectuals by the Soviet regime. Many Ukrainian dissidents, poets and writers attended the premiere and made public statements right in the movie theater. In case of artistic duet of Ada Rybachuk and Volodymyr Melnichenko, this escapism had even greater scale. First as graduation students and later as mature artists, they traveled several times to Kolguyev Island of Nenets Autonomous Okrug of Russia, located in the southeastern Barents Sea. They first went there while working on their diplomas at the Kyiv Art Institute to avoid the pressure of choosing politically engaged Soviet-oriented topics for their canvases and be able to search for truly independent themes and images. And they found them in everyday life and genuine culture. There was nothing disrespectfully exoticizing in their approach. They were not looking for an exotic other, but for friends and like-minded community. And they found a second family at Kolguyev, whom they depicted in their monumental ceramic sculptures, now exhibited in their home museum in Kyiv. A very typical product of the 60s was the Suchastnik Club, which can be translated as coeval or the person of the same generation. It was a Komsomol-controlled enterprise that made the liberalization of culture visible and won the loyalty of artists. A typical phenomenon of the Khrushchev thaw. But the establishment of this club coincided with the beginning of major anti-Soviet twists in the lives of its active members like Les Stanyuk, Ivan Svetlichny and Alla Horska. The aspirations and content of the club's activities went beyond the limits of the allowed liberties rather quickly. The club's core members were passionately focused on rediscovery of Ukrainian folk culture and the legacy of the local avant-garde, which had both been repressed in the 30s under Stalin's regime. The activities also included poetry readings and experimental theater production of previously banned performances, ethnographical expeditions led by historians to discover previously lesser-known parts of Ukraine, small villages with their own traditions and folk culture, or old historical sites with half-forgotten architectural objects, or interest in natural areas which were less known or totally unknown to the inhabitants of the big Sovietized cities. One can say that the most important of this club's endeavors were aimed at nothing less than re-establishment of the collective historical memory and national identity beyond the official Soviet narrative.